Okay. No, go ahead. Hey, happens to me all the time. Chuck has said that in regard to him, in regard to Paul, that he has not always been the best example to follow, and that kind of gives you hope about other people looking up to you or following you. That hopefully they would follow the parts, as Paul says, be examples of me as I also am an example of Christ. Go ahead. Now you remember. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Ah. Chuck has said that we all have the potential of being good examples or bad examples, and it's easier for us to see bad examples in other people, good or bad for that matter, than it is in ourselves. And so, for that reason, we should take pause in the way we look at things. Um, I want you to think for a minute where Paul was. Paul was an apostle. Now, I'm not saying that he was better spiritually because he was an apostle. I'm saying he was an apostle. He was the one in charge of establishing churches, of being there to work with them. And think for a moment, what model did Jesus give his disciples for making other disciples? Yes, sir. A shepherding model. So he took special effort to mentor, certainly in the beginning, a small number of individuals, like starting with 12 disciples and perhaps moved up to something larger. But it was kind of a shepherd taking care of the sheep. And what is the assumption of sheep? Okay, they're going to go astray. So it's very important that you are very helpful with them, as you try to lead them. Another way of looking at, if you think how is in terms of being mentored, having another Christian carry them along, or having another Christian lead and guide them, maybe one-on-one, until they were strong enough to be on their own. How did Paul become a missionary? Who mentored him? Well, I'm sure as an apostle he had that, but there was a human being that mentored him. Paul. Barnabas. Barnabas basically took Paul under his arm, and especially during those early years, and certainly during the first missionary journey, Barnabas was there. He was the mentor to Paul. As a matter of fact, early on, Barnabas was spoken of as being the primary one in the duo. The text mentions Barnabas and Saul, but then that changes. It shifts to Paul and Barnabas. And basically what we see, especially in the kind of split up they had at the beginning of the second missionary journey, we see the mentoring relationship reaching its goal, where Paul was perfectly capable of branching out on his own. And it's kind of like you said, Diane, they had different ideas about how that mission work needed to be taken care of. And so basically, we look at that as the dispute. I mean, even the Bible says there was a sharp dispute between them. But we look at that as a negative thing. What that actually did was allowed the two men to divide into two missionary teams that could now do more work. And the whole idea is that as we mentor people and they go on to mentor others, discipleship will expand exponentially. More and more people become disciples. I think I told you of the gentleman in South Alabama who used to boast that he had baptized over 200 individuals. Well, I think that's wonderful. He did great Bible study. He would meet with them. But once he was through with the study and the baptism, he was done, if you know what I mean. What happens to Christians that we don't continue to work with? They fall away, and that's what happened to most of those people that he baptized. So what Paul is doing here, I think he's speaking of a mentoring relationship. Be followers of me, even as I also am of Christ. In fact, Paul imparted that same strategy to Timothy, 2 Timothy 2:2, when he said, those things you have heard from me impart to faithful men who would be able to what? Teach others also. So you see that as a mentoring relationship. I think that Christianity was able to grow the way it did in an environment where there was no mass media, in an environment where there was no radio or certainly inexpensive publishing materials. The reason it was able to grow is because it was passed on from person to person to person. So that tells me that evangelism has to be something that you and I are willing to invest our lives in. In other words, we have to invest our lives in lost people. We have to spend our time with people who are lost and bring them to Jesus. But it doesn't end there. We have to continue to be with them and continue to work with them until they reach maturity. And I think that is valuable for us to understand because it kind of changes our paradigm of the way evangelism should be done. Instead of the Billy Graham type crusades, which of course, I mean, they could reach thousands and thousands of people, and through mass media and through publications and through many other things that can be done. But the great thing about true evangelism is it doesn't cost any money. I want you to think about that. Evangelism doesn't cost money, but it does cost you your time and your life. And so that's the reason Paul was able to say, be followers of me even as I also am of Christ. Because that was his whole concept of bringing people along. As people come to know Christ, we are involved in their lives. We share. Any other comment? Yes, ma'am, Diane. Yes.
You're raising them like you would your own kid and making sure that they, are understanding what the scripture teaches. Yeah, so you would do that with your own child.
Well, there is this paradigm within I guess it's mentoring leadership, or perhaps it's business leadership that kind of describes the situation that we're talking about. I don't think it was created for church setting, but I think it applies. Whenever we are new Christians or whenever someone comes to the church first time, they are unconsciously incompetent. Now think about that for a second. They are not able to follow Christ just yet. They do not know what they need to do. They do not yet have the skills to be able to apply that. And they don't know that's the case. You know what I'm saying? They're unconsciously incompetent. Go ahead.
Yeah, I went a long time when I was baptized. I knew I was going to, but not being good enough. This is going to make it.
Mm-hmm.
But things didn't get better until I did.
You're
I didn't have that spiritual help until I was baptized.
Harold said the same thing was true in his life. That early on he was haunted with these doubts. That actually is the second level of bringing someone along in a mentor relationship, is you become consciously incompetent. There's a big difference between unconsciously incompetent and being consciously incompetent. If you ask me to rebuild your engine in your car, I would say, I'm sorry, I just don't have the skills. I can't do that. There are not enough YouTube videos out there that would allow me to learn how to help you. Now, there might have been a time in my life when I would say, sure, let's try it. But I was unconsciously incompetent. The next step, the third step in the mentor-mentoree relationship, is when you become consciously competent. Consciously competent. That is when you realize that you now are learning and that you're growing in the faith. And see, it's the whole point of the mentor to help bring you to that state where you began to know. In Mark chapter 8, Mark makes a big deal of it in his gospel, but whenever Peter exclaimed, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," Jesus says, "You got it, Peter. You got it." Peter had reached the point where he came to know, and that's important for Mark because Mark is trying to get this message over that Jesus is the Son of God. And now the disciples have a grasp on it. And so Peter had reached the point where he had become consciously competent, at least in that particular fact. And then, of course, the fourth stage is when we become unconsciously competent. It's when we do what is necessary, we do what is right, but it's now second nature. I'm thinking of Sully Sullivan. Remember the guy that landed the plane on, what was it, the Hudson, wasn't it? Miracle on the Hudson, I think, was what the news media was calling it. Everybody was extolling him as a hero. But what Sully had done is he had been trained for years and years and years and years and years. He had the muscle memory. He knew exactly what he needed to do to fly that plane. Now, can you think for a moment in an emergency if he had pulled down that flight manual and said, okay, now let's look in the index. What is emergency landing on water? What am I going to need to do for that? What would have happened to the plane? It certainly would have crashed. But you see, he was unconsciously competent. He knew what to do. All of this really kicked in the moment. And this is the goal for all Christians, is to become unconsciously competent, where we know how to follow Christ. I think it was N.T. Wright in his book on trying to think of the name of it. It was his New Christian book. It's the one that he wrote. There was a British title for it. There was an English title of it, and the word Christianity is in it. it was probably his counterpart to C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. But he says that is the reason that we are here on the earth, why God didn't just let us go on up to heaven when we were baptized. He says what God wants us to do is learn to grow in the Christian virtues so that when Jesus comes again, we will have already begun to be equipped for the work that we're going to do in the afterlife. Now, I wish he would tell us a little bit more about what that work's going to be. I have often come away reading N.T. Wright after he speaks of the afterlife and what Christians will be doing. And I said, okay, give us some examples. But I don't have a lot of that. Anything else that you want to mention about? Yes.
Getting back to the mentoring thing, I believe that the person you're trying to bring to right kind of thing, they have to see that you really care about them.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of a starting point. Because if you start preaching at them or evaluating issues, they need to see in each person that's trying to mentor another person that they really care about them before they leave the room.
That's really good. Jen says, back to the mentoring thing, people need to know that you love them before you can really talk with them about what's going on in their life. That's one of the problems that we have with mass evangelism type techniques, or also, like my friend in South Alabama, I think that's one of the problems that we had, and he thought volume was the answer. But you know, he may have been responsible for 200,000 lives if he would have took the time with each one of those individual Christians and brought them along the way they needed to be brought along. In the back, Anita.
I don't think it was intended for us to be just alone with the kingdom of God in our
Good.
We're a group. We are a body, and we refer to that, and I think sometimes we're not sure what that means. But when I'm here, it's part of the kingdom of God. And I'm with people that make me happy. I'm with God, and I just feel different in this atmosphere. And hopefully I take that home with me. And hopefully the more I'm here, the more I will have strength in my own body to do better in the outer world. And that's one thing. Even Paul was always sharing himself, and I think that's so important. Not just yourself, but as he did as one of them, he was sharing. I'm one of you in this way and this.
Mm-hmm.
And I know when I talk to people, a couple I've been talking to recently, I talk about how wonderful it is to get together here and what we do and how much it's enjoyable and all that.
I think that's a wonderful example, that a part of being in a body is that this is a dynamic that works as a church as a whole with one another. You grow for being a part of the church, but the church also grows as they reach out to you. In the back, yes.
Well, I just think one thing that's cool about the whole system is the mentor also grows from that relationship so much. When you asked earlier about, how you feel about people looking to you as an example, my mind went back when I was young. I went to a Mennonite church for a while, and I wore a head covering for 17 years. And if you are wearing a head covering, you're not going to be cutting people off in traffic and being unkind to a waitress, because it's a constant reminder that you are an example. And with mentoring people, I feel like it has that same function. It really causes you to examine yourself and to grow in a lot of ways. Well, they say the best way to learn something is to teach it. And just in general, the cool thing is not only are the people that are being mentored able to grow, but the mentor does too.
Janet says, for her anyway, and I think it's true for all of us, when we have a true sense that our actions are influencing other people and that people actually look toward us for that we behave better. We behave differently because we do so with that in mind. I think that is so valuable. Paul knew that as a minister of the gospel, and that's the reason he often would bring up what's going on in his life and how he would handle a certain thing, because he had established that mentor relationship with the people with whom he worked. And one more thing I want to say, Anita, kind of based on what your comments were, we need to think of the church maybe not just as mentors, maybe not like one-on-one, I'm your mentor or you're my mentor, but that the whole church, in one sense, are to be mentors. And if you think, what group within the church, and I'm saying this is in most established churches, what group within the church are the new Christians? The young, because they have to be taught, they have to be trained, they have to be shown. Now I want to think with you for a moment. What does that say about our age-graded model of Christian education?
The older people should have more wisdom.
It eliminates the older who might be mentors within that group. And what I'm saying is not that we shouldn't have age graded, because I think there are situations in which young people can learn best when they're in that. But there also is an element that they can't get from their peers. There's an element that can come from older, more mature Christians. And so as a church, we need to mix it up more with our youth. And we need to see our youth as mentorees, new disciples, whatever word that we want to use to describe that, so that we can apply ourselves in those circumstances and work with them. There are some programs within the church that try to take advantage of this. In the South, there is a program called Lads to Leaders. Anyone familiar with that? Lads to Leaders. And the whole point of Lads to Leaders is to try to pair older men up with the young men, and older women up with the young ladies, and try to teach them various skills within the church. And things like public speaking, song leading. My daughter came down last week to visit with us, and we were going through some old pictures. I store all my pictures on Amazon Photos, and so they're available on my Fire Stick. And so we can sit down and we can fast forward through the pictures if we want. We could look at all of those things. And we have a picture of my daughter reading at one of these Lads to Leaders convention, Bible reading. And it was so funny. And she laughed too, because she was scripture reading and she had her Bible up like this. And we all got a good laugh out of that. But that was experience that she would have never gotten. And she never would have learned how to hold the Bible right if she hadn't been involved in that program. As you move west, there is a program called Christian Training for Service. Who's familiar with Christian Training for Service? In many ways, Christian Training for Service is probably, from what I understand, I think it's a little farther along in the process of training young people. But again, it's an organized focus to try to get older people working with younger people. And here is where this is so valuable for us, and we already have a number of our members that are involved in this. That's the reason that our homes need to be open to the youth. That's the reason that we need to volunteer for things like youth devotionals. That's the reason we need to be chaperones on youth trips. We need to be involved in all of those various things. You know, it has kind of fallen out of favor in conservative circles, but really it does in many ways take a village, or should we say it takes a church. It takes a church to grow Christian disciples. And we all need to be involved. Yes, Anita.
It would seem as a church this size, one way to implement, a togetherness would be to have one of us, rotating to be guest speakers in our children's classes. And that way they will get to know you, that you're a real person, and depending on what kind of story you want to tell, or a song you'd like to let them know about, or something in the past, that's going to help mentor them.
And that is certainly a need that we have here, to have more people rotate. And if we did that, it would also take away the number one reason that many teachers drop out after a certain number of years, and that's burnout. We just constantly use them over and over again until they just can't do it anymore. But yeah, to be able to swap out in those instances. When we had our life group in different places, and based on the age of our children, sometimes our children would join our life group, and they were like teens. Now, don't get me wrong. The whole point of a life group is that we can open up and we can share what's going on in our life, and sometimes adults may have things that they need to share that children, don't need to be there for. But at the same time, my children were able to interact and to see these older people as friends in Christ. It was 2 years ago this summer, my children went down to Gulf Shores, Orange Beach, which is in South Alabama. It's our Alabama coast. And we had a friend that used to be a part of our group, a lady, and the children actually drove to see her. They took a part of their vacation and they drove to see this older woman that was a part of our group. She was one that was always very active. She was always cooking. But they drove to see her and visit her on that particular trip. So let's not underestimate the power that we have of being disciples and mentors for young people. But what is said, and I've seen a number of you when we've had a new Christian come in, and maybe in a life group situation or something, they shared, perhaps even overshared sometimes, and you guys have stepped in and encouraged them. And, put your arm. Well, that's part of it. Something that Adam said in a communion devotional 2 or 3 weeks ago. He didn't put this name on it, but later I spoke, and I called it nudge evangelism, where what we do is we every day of our lives, we interact with people in such a Christian way that part of our Christianity will allow God the opportunity to work through us with what is said or what is done to touch people's lives. You may not ever know the benefit of your daily nudges, but it's important as we work this out. One more thing that I want to say. I guess you're noticing that we're not getting into chapter 10 today. Okay, I'm sorry about that, but Lord willing, we'll be here next week to take care of that. And hey, if we're not, all the better, right? But One thing that I wanted to say that one of you brought up a couple of weeks ago, Paul says, I am not fighting like a man who's running aimlessly, or boxing like a man that's just shadow boxing and doing that. He says, I'm trying to do what I do with purpose, because after I've preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified from the prize. Now that prize there, that's an interesting expression. He mentions the crown of gold that a runner would get, like that a runner would get if he won the race. That's kind of what he kind of has in mind there, a prize. Now, where's the first place your mind goes to when you think of the prize? Yes, sir. Salvation, your own personal salvation, getting to go to heaven, getting to be with God. Bob, would you want to share what your perspective was on that?
Yeah, I heard from someone who viewed the prize as other Christians that are able to share their something for
Okay, here, Bob says he heard one interpretation of the prize would be the personal reward that Paul would have in seeing people that he helped save or he helped bring to Christ. And this is not the first time Paul would use that in that example, because he would often say, when Jesus comes again, you guys, seeing you saved, you're going to be my joy. When I see you, you're going to be my prize. That's what I will see. And perhaps, I told you before that I believe in degrees of reward, perhaps even degrees of punishment, but certainly degrees of reward when we get to be with Jesus. He says, lay up for yourself treasures in heaven, so there is at least in some way that the way that we live and conduct ourselves here will affect our afterlife. Paul said the same thing in 1 Corinthians 3 about how we work. But could it be, in that instance, the prize he's talking about will be the people that we have helped lead to Christ? Now think with me one more moment. Our time has passed. Wouldn't one of the greatest joys that you have when you get to heaven is to see that your children are there as well? Wouldn't one of the most wonderful things that you would have when you get to heaven is to realize that your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren or all those individuals that were a part of your faith lineage will be there? Wouldn't it be wonderful if your best friend, the people that you walk with, the people that you work with, is when you get to heaven, there they are. And they're there because of you. That's really a wonderful thought to kind of end with today. So let's do that. Next week, listen, you actually have your study sheet now in advance. You can kind of read ahead and see where we're going to be. But we'll look at 1 Corinthians 10 next week. And I thank you for your time.